Greetings. Hello. Welcome to the Department of African and African Diaspora Studies seminar series. As you know, we've had a very solid lineup this semester, and that continues with Professor Jason Moore, who is joining us from Binghamton University. Before we get into that presentation and introduce ourselves to Jason, I do want to remind those who are contemplating graduate study that in less than a month, our deadline for applications for our MA and PhD program comes due on December 1st. Please go to our webpage and review the requirements for that if you're interested in applying. But back to our seminar. And Jason Moore, a dear friend of mine who I wish I would see more often. I blame myself entirely for not making that happen. We have somebody who is arguably in his mid-career, early mid-career, one of the most preeminent, if not the most preeminent scholar on the intersection between climate and political economy. He occupies many different academic terrains: sociology, political economy, world history, geography, and other areas as well. And by integrating these seemingly disparate areas of research, he really brings together an impressive whole in terms of being able to understand the phenomena under his review. And so we are going to be treated, I'm sure, to a very special and important presentation by him today. So you have seen our poster, and you have seen Jason's many accomplishments. And we are going to get right into his presentation on the origins of climate apartheid, climate class colonialism in the making of planetary crisis. Jason, we are so happy to have you here, to have you back.
Thanks, Jeff. It's such an honor, such a pleasure to be here and talking with all of you. I want to thank you, Jeff, for inviting me, and Rachel Hegland for doing some of the footwork to publicize this event. And I'm very honored to be speaking, and especially to have the opportunity to think through with all of you a series of provocations around the origins of climate apartheid. And this is, perhaps more than most of my talks, really what I believe to be a fundamentally pressing intellectual and political question of how race, class, and gender are really pivotal and constitutive of the ongoing capital-ogenic drive towards the planetary inferno. And so take this as my own adventure and provocation and invitation to all of you to enter into a conversation that will bring together many of these pressing themes. So let's begin with some of the climate reality. We are now exiting the Holocene, which for geologists means recent era. That's the 11,700 years of relative climate stability. What era we are entering remains to be seen. But the pivot of this point is that we civilization, class society has existed and indeed made possible this long era of climate stability, and a particular kind of racialized class society, capitalism, is now driving us headlong into the planetary inferno. So say goodbye to the Holocene. Well, hello to the Anthropocene. And we can see this kind of headline here: human caused, anthropogenic. Humans are doing X, driving the planetary crisis, driving the climate crisis. And this is, of course, a very old argument that goes back to Malthus in the late 18th century, in the era of profound class revolt, not least the Haitian Revolution and the Irish Revolt of 1798 as well. Great fears of the French and English ruling classes. But it also has a longer history that we're going to tease out here. So I want to say Anthropocene, age of man, not so fast. But where to move from here is not exactly simple. Age of man, age of capital, what do these terms mean? What do they relate to? And we're going to have an opportunity to visit and revisit these questions across the arc of this talk. Age of man, Anthropocene can mean a very geologically specific argument about stratigraphic markers, for instance, chicken bones and nuclear residues from atomic testing, or it can be a more popular version about the origins of planetary crisis in the so-called Industrial Revolution. So in all instances, as with the environmental imaginary, almost always we should beware the imperial we. We should beware the imperial humanity, which has been more than a misrecognition or a misinterpretation, but a concrete instrument, a conceptual hammer of imperial rule over the centuries. So we have two Anthropocenes, a geological one in which it's entirely appropriate to talk about species level activities in terms of doing natural history. And we have a popular argument, an argument about the drivers of today's planetary crisis, which ultimately defaults to some mix of overpopulation, runaway markets, and bad technology. And there are profound arguments, profound problems rather, in that conceptualization. On the other side now, we have a lot of scenes, but of course one is dominant, the capital O scene. And the capital O scene argument in all its variations has the virtue of doing what the global environmental imaginary has always refused to do, name the system. It says, no, indeed, humans as a whole are not responsible for the climate. It is the 1%. It is the 8 people who own more wealth than the bottom 3.6 billion people on the planet. That is overwhelmingly female, overwhelmingly people of color. There are at least 3 capital scenes, and I'll give you the first 2, which I see as, in a sense, mirror images of each other. One is a rather traditional Marxist, I'll even call it a liberal Marxist argument that rests on an Anglo-centric England first story and reduces the questions to coal and the steam engine and class struggle. And this is the fossil capital thesis. The other is one of class erasure, and this is associated with the very, very stimulating work of Françoise Berger on the racial capitalocene, in which class is erased in favor of racialized labor and work. And it creates these are either or propositions that should properly be put together. So they're not false as such, but they are too partial. And so they ignore the Malm fossil capital thesis is unwilling to consider the centrality of domination, racism, but also sexism and other forms of imperial rule in world accumulation and the worldwide class struggle. The other is unwilling to consider the centrality of class formation and de facto proletarianization, even in the Plantation Revolution, under conditions of the capitalist law of value. But let's not ignore door number 3, which is the interpretation that comes out of the global conversation of activists and artists and academics that I'm a part of, the world-ecology conversation. And this says we need to put together questions of power, capital, and life as an evolving and mutually formative whole. And so for the world ecology, we present the capitalocene not as a formal definition, but as a provocation, as a geopoetics, a foil to show that the Anthropocene represents bourgeois naturalism and the imperial imagination in forms that are somehow palatable to a sizable layer of the working class in the rich countries of the world. That is, it plays directly into post-1968 environmentalism, which was always premised, in Paul Ehrlich's words, on too many people, which in practice always meant too many brown people. And so here the capitalocene is a provocation to put together and really rethink the long histories and contemporary realities of the geocultures of domination, capital accumulation, class struggles, empire, all within the web of life. And that, it turns out, matters quite a bit if we want to come to grips with the climate crisis as something more than a ping pong of natural forces and social consequences and social forces and natural consequences. The history and the contemporary politics depends much more nuanced, interrelational, dialectical view of this problem. So there's a lot here, and I don't expect you all to pass an exam on these questions, but I just want to hit a few key points of emphasis in what we're doing with the world ecology conversation, because I think it will help you frame and make sense of of my position as we walk through the rest of this talk. One is that all human activity is already part of nature. And here I'm very much influenced by Marx, amongst others, who talks about the labor process as an active, self-forming moment of human nature, the rest of nature, and the ways in which webs of life produce and transform us as humans and our organizations, but also how we produce and transform extra-human webs of life. We insist that nature is not an innocent term. Nature and civilization are ruling abstractions. They drip with blood and dirt, as Marx might say. So when I talk about capital and nature, civilizing projects and all the rest, I'm not using these in innocent terms. That when radicals and eco-socialists are using nature and society to narrate the crisis, they are embodying the problem that is often associated to that great Einstein epigraph that the thinking that created the problem is unlikely to solve it. Thirdly, the capitalism's law of value, that is, its rules of reproduction of accumulating capital and organizing the endless accumulation of capital, is fundamentally a law of cheap nature, which and cheap nature is not just about the value composition or price history of these four cheaps. It is also fundamentally about the devaluation of the lives and labors of women, nature, and colonies, in Maria Mies's terms. And it highlights how capitalism is an epoch-making apparatus of human sacrifice. I use Nestor King's wonderful turn of phrase and argument here, that most human beings in the history of capitalism have been moved out of civilization and put into the realm of nature in the uppercase N, the better they could be treated cheaply and exploited, and their labors appropriated as cheaply as possible. And finally, for the world ecology conversation, in contrast to orthodox Marxism and most of the work in the environmental humanities, insists that these political questions, conceptual questions, have to be answered on the terrain of world history. The point is to understand how actually existing capitalism has worked so that we can understand the actually existing unfolding of planetary crisis today. So I'm not one of these people who thinks Marx was right about everything. So I want to put that out front in the beginning. But there are a series of fragments that I think suggest a synthesis. And we all might come to different conclusions on the contours of that synthesis. But these are some of the key elements I want to play around with here. First of all, what certainly historical materialism has forgotten is what Marx and Engels insist in their opening introduction to the German ideology, essentially the classic statement of historical materialism, which is to study the actually existing relations of humans to the rest of nature and to start out from the climatic, geological, geographical questions, the physical nature of man. And by that, they didn't mean lay out the conditions and then go on and do the rest of the analysis. In the great tradition of dialectics, they meant that this would shape all their analyses of modes of production, of class struggles, of everything else. There is the fundamental historical insistence that slavery and racism are historical formations. And I often paraphrase this in relation to coal. I say coal is just a rock in the ground. It only becomes fossil fuel under definite historical conditions. And I put these moments of race and racialization with class formation and mode of production and class relations, because I think that as many as Black Marxism and many others have long pointed out, these are fundamental to each other. And I'll try to tease out over the next little bit why I think in terms of how capital works, they're fundamental to each other and how we can see that in the history of capitalism. But then finally, to join the questions of race and class with the web of life, not only the large scale climatic conditions, which of course are increasingly important to our present conjuncture, but also by understanding that capitalism degrades the original sources of all wealth, the soil and the worker, human nature and the rest of nature. And my short answer to how these are connected, it has to do with super exploitation, which is a concept in search of a theory in the Anglo-American, in Anglophonic Marxism. And I think what I want to do here is to essentially turn the traditional Marxist model inside out and ask, well, why is the English proletarian in Manchester in 1820 the ideal type or the benchmark of the proletarian figure? Why is not the plantation slave the essential figure? And my argument has to do with both of these registers of cheapness. One is that the opportunities for the exploitation of surplus value were greater under conditions of racialized plantation work, but also that it fit very well with an emerging civilizing project in the course of capitalism. For those of you who know anything about my work, you'll know I love to talk about dualisms of binaries and nature and society, civilization and savagery. And it's become clear to me over the past few years that I haven't done a very good job in making clear what I meant, because it is so often misrepresented, and the central ideological and geocultural point that turns on racism and sexism was somehow lost. And I think perhaps I didn't make this as clear. So from 1492 onward, we see a succession of overlapping Christianizing, civilizing, and developmentalist projects that have drawn and redrawn the world color line, in fact, many world color lines, to create regimes of cheap nature, including, of course, cheap labor, and to justify them in the name of progress, salvation, civilization, development. This, of course, a cognate story can, and I'm in the midst of struggling with this question as well, a cognate story can be told around globalizing patriarchy as well. When I pose the question why, I'm not giving the universal answer, but one of the answers that has been, well, unfortunately, either not addressed or brushed aside. And so I would say that the importance of the frontier under conditions of modern imperialism, which of course goes back to 1492, and we'll problematize that a little bit in just a moment. But the conditions of modern imperialism are essentially driven by the power of metropolitan working classes and sometimes peasantries, combined with, of course, the industrial dynamism and capitalist competition that makes the search for the four cheaps, labor, food, energy, and raw materials, paramount. So these civilizing projects form the foundation for understanding how modern relations of gender and race emerged, and that proletarianization was fundamentally racialized and gendered such that we cannot speak about proletarianization in the modern world without understanding that they are always gendered and racialized. And this unfolds around these binaries that are, as I mentioned, far more than epistemological. They are practical instruments of domination. And so when I talk about nature and civilization, or civilization and savagery, and all the cognate terms, including humanity with the uppercase H, as ruling abstractions, what I'm saying is that these were fundamental geocultural moments of domination necessary to sustain the rate of profit and accumulation in the metropolitan centers of capitalism, then and now. And so you can see here that we need to put together these moments of civilization and nature, of racialized and gendered class formation and struggle, with the political economy of it all. And it's bad enough that the questions of class are almost always dropped from the frame or overrepresented, to use Sylvia Wynter's great turn of phrase. But the questions of how capital accumulation works and why the dynamic of capital accumulation itself requires such domination, the domination of webs of life, of women, of peoples of color, it has often not even been posed as a meaningful query. So here I want to give you an initial hot take, and don't worry, we'll come back to it throughout our discussion. But that what we see from the middle of the 16th century very dramatically is the drawing of a line of civilization and savagery in which a very, very small part of Europe, in fact, Europe as a geohistorical entity only forms in the aftermath of 1492. But the line around civilization is drawn such that the rest of the world, the naturales in Peru, the Africans become monsters and slaves become barbarians, as these are common tropes well into the 19th century, that this line of civilization and savagery is emergent and really crystallizes during this period between 1550 and 1700. This was also an era of climate crisis, and in part capitalogenic climate crisis, which I'll explain in a moment. But for now, we need to understand that capitalism forms in a moment of profound, or consolidates in a moment of profound climate crisis after the climate and class destabilization of feudalism. So just why is it that nature, that is the naturalized domination of women, nature, slaves, and colonies, is so crucial to how capital works? Well, the first thing is that we need to break with the economic formalism and the economism of, well, not just Marxism, but many strains of economic history. That we need to understand that the circuit of capital and the world market is relatively powerless to secure the underlying conditions of its own prosperity. That is, these four chiefs of labor, food, energy, and raw materials. But it goes deeper than that. For every act of exploiting, say, the Fordist assembly line worker, it depends on a much larger act of appropriating the unpaid work energy from women, nature, and colonies. So capitalism booms when it can mobilize work for free or low cost through these mechanisms of geocultural domination, civilizing development, and so forth. And this is just something to sort of get your juices flowing. What I want to do is to break with also the fetishism of the proletariat and to reconstruct a notion of the world's working classes, of the proletariat as combining in various ways proletarians, femitarians, that is the unpaid work of social reproduction, largely performed by women, and the biotariat, to quote, to use Stephen Collis's wonderful turn of phrase, that we need to have, without losing the dynamics and strength of class analysis, an expansive sense that deals with social reproduction and reproductive justice for the web of life as a whole. So this goes against the grain both of neoclassical and Marxist thinking. The capitalism booms not by commodifying nature all the way down, to quote Neil Smith, but in fact by the opposite, that capitalism enters into crisis when it more fully commodifies the labor and other conditions of capitalist reproduction within its grasp. So this is an old tenet of both migration studies and proletarianization literatures, that proletarianization is an expensive way to keep workers at the factory gates. And that's why for every great wave of proletarianization, there has been a move to appropriate even greater volumes of unpaid work. And this one way to think about this is that for every act of proletarianization, capitalism needs to find humans, usually people of color, usually women, to bear the burden of the so-called second shift. So capitalism booms when small amounts of capital can be set into motion to take advantage of oceans of cheap nature. So you can see here that's a very simplified and idealized model that capital booms under these conditions. And that green is not just, oh, it's easy to go and cut down forest. Or the blue and the green are not just nature in the abstract, they are human nature. They are women, nature, and colonies, as Maria Mies reminds us, and that they are politically and geoculturally enabled, and also scientifically in some important ways that we'll return to over the course of this talk. But now we also see how it goes bust. The climate crisis radically compresses, and today's climate crisis goes even farther by threatening to invert the fundamental relation, the fundamental political economy of capitalism in the web of life, which is that capitalism in the web of life has always used the rest of nature to reduce its costs of production. Today, climate crisis is inverting that so that the climate and the rest of nature has gone from a subsidy to a cost for capital accumulation. And I think that explains something of the turn towards ethno-nationalism. So we're in a moment of planetary crisis that is a climate crisis. And these are not identical, but they form two moments of a self-forming whole. There is clearly a crisis of life-making in various registers. And there is clearly also a crisis of profit-making that is not just from depletion and exhaustion in an old-fashioned way, but also from class struggles over the terms of food, justice, social reproduction, which is coming out around Blockadia, around climate justice movements, food sovereignty movements, and is really, in a sense, breaking out all over. So again, here we are at the end of the Holocene. And what I want to suggest here is that we start to think about the geophysical moments and the geohistorical moments as a whole in the present moment. So we can see here, and you've all seen a million charts like this, the prospect is not good. And if we are looking at 4 and 5 degrees Celsius increases, there is going to be a fundamental transformation top to bottom of everything that we know about civilization today, such as it is. So what I want to ask is, if we put together the geophysicality of the climate crisis with the climate class divide, climate patriarchy, climate apartheid, we have a serious intellectual and therefore political question, which is, are these converging, somehow coming from different lines on the map, or are they mutually formative? And I'll try to give both a theoretical and a historical answer to this. But first, let's think about this climate class divide, climate patriarchy, climate apartheid as a whole, and zero in on this apartheid moment. So let me just give you a few descriptors very, very quickly. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this at one level or another, and these are just a few descriptors. So global warming is already contributing to global inequality. It's already contributing to food insecurity. We know that, and this is a point made by environmental justice advocates from the 1980s onward. I think of the path-breaking work of Bullard, the United Church of Christ report in 1987. But of course, here is in the Niger Delta, the equivalent of one Exxon Valdez spill every year for a half century. We know that the costs of climate change, the violence of climate change, is imposed disproportionately on peoples of color around the world. We can just take a glimpse at these maps. The redder and yellower are the most at risk. For some reason, Australia is in the green, which seems a little bit silly to me, but environmental racism takes many forms. And so we have this description that I think many of us are ready to entertain in one way or another, but we're still not sure what to make of it. My job is not to provide a comprehensive theory of climate apartheid, but to suggest some of the foundational elements of such a theory and to really go beyond where Nancy Tuana does in 2019 in a very gifted piece, a very important intervention here. But without any consideration of class and capital. And it seems to me that if we're going to talk about world color lines, well, I'm a Du Boisian on this question. The question of the world color line and the worldwide class struggle are non-identical, but deeply and intimately connected. So For me, I always want to go and look at the history and see where we can see the historical origins of this process. So the first thing that I want to note here is that climate apartheid and climate patriarchy are not inventions of the 21st century. They are emergent properties of the long, cold 17th century, which was the worst and most severe passage of what is called the Little Ice Age, a 5.5 century period between roughly 1300 and 1850 that characterized the northern hemisphere. In the tropical zones, it was characterized by drought, and that had very important interrelations with the slaving trade. I won't get into that, but I wanted to footnote that so that we're not falling into a Eurocentric trap here. But this is not the origins of climate apartheid. In fact, climate apartheid finds its origins in the emergence of mass slavery and the rapid acceleration of the slave trade after 1570 above all. This is also true, as Federici tells us, for the era of the witch hunts and the profound epoch-making gendered counter-revolution within Europe in the mid-16th century, subsequently globalized across the Atlantic. So what this does is turn inside out the whole sort of meta-narrative of Orthodox Marxism, but also of environmental history and climate theory, that it all begins with the Industrial Revolution. No, it does not. If there is a revolution that it begins with, it is not the Industrial Revolution, but the Plantation Revolution, which really matures by the 1570s in Brazil, with important antecedents in Sao Tome and Madeira, as I've talked about elsewhere. So in this light, the steam engine is the result of the capitalist revolution, not the driver of it. So climate apartheid emerges through mass slavery as a response not to anthropogenic, made by humans, not to anthropogenic climate change, but to capitalogenic climate change in part. Now, natural forcing was decisive in the long, cold 17th century. Volcanism and fluctuations in solar radiation, along with oscillations in the Gulf Stream, were all much more important, but aggravating it was what Lewis and Maslin, the great biogeographers, call the Orbis spike, Orbis after the Latin for globe. And the Orbis spike was a direct result of the New World genocides, the destruction of 95% of the New World's population, which in turn led to carbon drawdown, both in reforestation and in soils. And you can see here the red line indicating the low point in carbon dioxide concentrations over the past 1,000 years. So New World genocides lead to simultaneously, or not quite simultaneously, but in rapid succession, the climate crisis of the long, cold 17th century, and really the maturing and acceleration of the global slave trade. And I can't go into all the details here, but what I've done is to take Eltis's database on the volume of the Atlantic slave trade and put it together with Angus Madison's guesstimates around Western European economic growth to show you the centrality of surplus profit, super exploited surplus value that was derived from the slave trade and from the sugar plantation complex. Of course, this is only suggestive at this moment, but these are rates of increase from 0 or 1 proportionately. So you can see the centrality of super exploitation as fundamental to the moment of climate change in the long, cold 17th century. And remember, dramatic, unfavorable climate shifts in capitalism mean a reduction of the possibilities for appropriating cheap natures in all sorts of ways. This is here, we're just fleshing this picture out so that you can have a sense. Simultaneously within sub-Saharan Africa, you have a relentless slaving frontier, as Joseph Miller and Thornton and many others have narrated, that is linked to recurrent sugar revolutions from Madeira, Sao Tome, Brazil, and then into the West Indies. This is the Plantation Revolution, and it relies on every point on frontiers of cheap labor, energy, land, raw materials at every single juncture. This was the driving engine of capital accumulation until the early 19th century. And so we can't just dismiss that when we want to come to grips with this process. But also let me foreground another point, and I can do it no more in passing, that the sugar frontier, the slaving frontier, and the ways they came together represented the most dramatic and violent forms of ecocide, the destruction of landscapes, of the devastation of forests, and the exhaustion of soils in one zone after another. And by the way, that's important because if you remember that Marx quote, the degradation of the soil and the worker, as soil exhaustion became more of a problem, slaves were worked harder, mortality rates increased. And we see this very clearly in the 18th century in places like Barbados and Jamaica. So capitalism is very much a system based on going to the frontier and using military power to channel vast sums, huge volumes of cheap nature into the apparatus of capital accumulation. And that's why sometimes we talk about this era as one of mercantilism. I think that that's really misleading. It's also misleading to talk about it in terms of merchant capital. If we want to talk about this, we can talk about an alliance of finance capital with planting capital, with military revolutions within Europe and abroad. And we can tease this out. But the characterizations of this era as one of mercantilism essentially has the effect of letting capitalism off the hook for the production of the world color line and planetary apartheid. So what we saw in this moment formed what we think of today as colonialism. That is, there was a climate forcing moment to European colonialism and the maturing of the overseas seaborne empires, especially those held by Northwestern European states, the Dutch, French, and English. This is important to keep in mind because this was a direct response to the climate crisis of the 16th and 17th centuries, that essentially you could deal with the great problems of social and political unrest. And oh, by the way, dramatic climate shifts are linked to moments of profound political unrest and social unrest. This is for the middle of the 16th century, the era of the English Revolution, of unrest and revolt in the English colonies in Brazil. This is a great map from Geoffrey Parker's foundational work on it. But it was also true about a century later, after 1783 to 1815, the last great cold snap of the Little Ice Age, when you have the revolutions of Haiti and France, you have Shays' Rebellion in the United States, you have the Irish Revolt, that unfavorable climate changes for the 1% are related to moments of revolt and unrest and therefore of political possibility. So again, this I'm reminding you here of the fix to the social unrest, which is wrapped up with climate, is, well, let's drive towards the tropical and subtropical zones where superior military power can be deployed to enforce the law of value and to extend the law of value. That's going to be hugely important in just a moment when we talk about the Industrial Revolution and its genesis here. So what we want to do with all of this is to understand that the Plantation Revolution was the pivot of modernity. This, of course, is a provocation, and I'm not saying this in any hard and fast ways, but it's worth really beginning to tease out here that the Plantation Revolution was the decisive institutional fix necessary to survive the climate crisis of the 17th century, and that the Plantation Revolution was an industrial revolution. So we should not fetishize coal. And it's very interesting to me that even on the Marxist left, but also on the neo-Malthusian left, there has been an elevation of this entity called coal into a theory of capital, when much more persuasive, as I hope you'll see, is a kind of plantation. If we want to talk about any kind of capital, it shouldn't be fossil capital, but plantation capital or color line capital, or please, somebody help me with a better metaphor. But also that the Plantation Revolution was proletarianizing. Now here, I don't want to suggest that it resembled the ideal type of the English, but rather maybe as a thought exercise, it should supplant the ideal type, because both the plantation slave and the English proletarian were in effect semi-proletarians in terms of their reproduction costs. The modern proletariat forms in the countryside almost everywhere, as we've known for a long time, and was semi-proletarianized from the beginning. And then what if we put the great marronage of Brazilian slaves of Palmeiras, which perhaps had 10,000 people at its height in the 16th century, not to mention Saint Domingue's revolution, alongside those of revolts and rebellions within Europe. So for this, I wanted to remind, I'm sure many of you are familiar with this line of argument, but it's really been forgotten in the recent rush to embrace something called a Plantationocene. This is a Plantationocene that has no patience, no tolerance, no interest in C.L.R. James or in W.E.B. Du Bois. And I put these two moments together, not so you can read every moment, every line here, but simply to remind us all that there is a powerful tradition within a kind of anti-imperialist Marxism that insists on slavery as a proletarian relation, and we can play around with that conceptually, and we should, and also Du Bois on what he calls the ultimate exploitation, which I take to be an implicit theory of super exploitation, that the normal, if you will, or preferred strategy for the 1% is imperialism or colonialism, which is a mechanism of class formation. And we shouldn't forget that. For some reason, in recent debates over the Capitalocene and the climate crisis, people forget that colonialism was all about class formation in the interest of producing tractable and plentiful cheap labor to produce for the world market. And remember Marx on the soil and the worker. This was also a moment of environment making. And so here you can see in medieval Europe, it took 200 years to clear 12,000 hectares of forest. In Brazil, at the height of the sugar boom, 12,000 hectares of forest performed. That labor, of course, was done by slaves. And that's really, really crucial. We want to put all these moments together. But we should ask, why in the first place did European imperialism privilege this drive across the oceans, which is hard, difficult, and indeed never before had empires constructed transoceanic empires? And so we should just ask the question. Well, the answer to the question is the confluence of climate change, the coming of the Little Ice Age, and the historic defeat of Western Europe's ruling classes through a long wave of peasant and urban proletarian revolt in the 14th and 15th centuries. These are only some of the most dramatic forms of this. This is from the Grand Jacquerie, or peasant revolt of 1358. But essentially, Europe's 1% had been defeated in the class struggle, and they had to go some other place to find working classes and peasantries to fully dominate. And only then could they come back to Europe and fully dominate and immiserate Europe's peasantries and working classes. So here we have a repeat. And I just want to, this is just a little illustration to understand the difference between the medieval warm period and the Little Ice Age, in case these might be new terms, which is totally understandable. And again, no exam on this. I'm just sharing this with you to give you a sense that moments of significant climate downturn, on the top are variations in solar intensity coming from the sun to the earth, and on the bottom are volcanic eruptions, which are hugely important in human affairs. But essentially every moment of unfavorable climate change, from the collapse of Western Rome all the way to the Haitian Revolution and the Industrial Revolution, moments of climate downturn, unfavorable climate shifts are moments of political possibility. And that should be remembered. That doesn't mean climate determines everything, but it means we can't explain any of these shifts abstracted from climate history. So I'm just going to walk through this very clearly because I want to maybe stake out a different position from that of Cedric Robinson and Black Marxism, who attributes a kind of enduring internalist racism to medieval Europe. And I'm not sure that he would argue the same position given the development of the historiography in the decades since. What I and Raj Patel have pointed at is the emergence of the Iberian holy war, finance capital, enslaving dynamic that is justified in terms of metaphysical and instrumentalism. This is our friend Vittoria, one of the leading theologians of the time, a very, very influential figure at the court. And essentially what the Spaniards and Portuguese held was that just as God stood before humans, and humans were imperfect matter, Iberians stood before indigenous peoples as a kind of God, a God race or a God species, and that the indigenous peoples were imperfect matter and needed to be civilized. This later would form into a Columbian and Cartesian dualism, not just I think, therefore I am, but I conquer, therefore I am. And the result of this, combined with the essential slaving, debt, military trinity that forms the decisive characteristics of Iberian expansion, imperialism in this period, the result was the Orbis spike. Don't be fooled by Alfred Crosby. This was not a virgin soil epidemic that led to 95% of American Indians dying. This was a direct result of slaving and colonialism in varied forms that led to this Orbis spike that we've talked about. Now, I want to fast forward as a way of sort of heading towards the end of this talk, and I'll apologize for not getting into this very clearly, that the Industrial Revolution, as we understand it, in fact, grows out of indigenous dispossession and genocide in the American South. Of course, the rapid reinvention and renewal of slavery, what Dale Tomich calls the second slavery, set in motion by the appropriation of a particular hirsutum strain of cotton that had been developed by indigenous peoples. You can't make this stuff up. That the indigenous peoples developed the strain of cotton that was used in the Industrial Revolution, that was grown on American cotton plantations like in Natchez County, Mississippi, and that the cotton gin was propelling. If I had to name a decisive technology of the Industrial Revolution, it would not be the steam engine, it would be the cotton gin. And indeed, Marx was perceptive enough to realize that it was nothing but the tremendous fall in the price of cotton, that there was nothing more important than that, as a condition for large-scale industry. So super exploitation was at the core of the Industrial Revolution. The Plantation Revolution made possible the so-called Industrial Revolution. And this was true in multiple registers that I can't fully elaborate, but I think that even if we don't fully agree with that proposition, it's a powerful thesis to think with and through to really get at the core of how racialized class relations and the frontier of industrial organization, the factory, the modern factory, which is essentially a version of the sugar frontier, was at the really decisive in propelling the Industrial Revolution. So now as we wrap this up, we can return to the Anthropocene and to climate change, geological and popular, all of that. So this I've already shared with you, so this will just be a refresher, a search for golden spikes in the stratigraphic layer. Nukes, chicken bones, plastics, what a wonderful civilization we have constructed here. But of course, there are two basic propositions. One is the Anthropocene, geological Anthropocene 1945. The other is, as I've suggested from Lewis and Maslin, the Orbis spike, genocide, climate change, slaving in the long cold 17th century. So guess which one's widely accepted? Well, the one that can be cleansed and made palatable to the widest possible audience, of course. But what I would point out is that both 1610 and 1945 were products of militarized accumulation, aimed at securing cheap labor or pacifying threats to cheap labor, that is in the era of imperial anti-communism. And that in every case, and this goes to American perceptions of Soviets and Russians as well, the objects, the people on the other side of militarized accumulation were in every event savages and barbarians, unwilling or unable to accept the wisdom of civilizing projects. And this is where the line blurs, where the geologists and the earth system scientists start to give us history lessons. This is a lot here. I'm not going to ask you to really make sense of this all, but the popular Anthropocene is essentially Cold War systems theory that was cooked up in the military academic industrial complex of the 1950s. This is not a polemic. This is where the limits to growth model from 1972, which is now widely used in more complex forms, comes from. It comes out of essentially the invention of modern computing. But also the popular Anthropocene tells us that we have to be virtuous consumers. We need to look for engineering solutions, not democracy. That we're all responsible for the crisis, so on and so forth. It puts sustainability ahead of justice, and it uses man and nature. Humans are causing this and that, anthropogenic climate change, instead of understanding capitalism and imperialism in the web of life. And it suggests that the origins are with the Industrial Revolution, but one cleansed of its racialized violence and genocide and all the rest. So this goes very much back to the post-1968 environmental imaginary. We've met the enemy and he is us. This is a poster from the first Earth Day. But it's also the era in which it became necessary to destroy the town in order to save it. A quote from a US Army major in 1968 in February during the Tet Offensive. So these two have to be put together because the Vietnamese had met the enemy, and it was not the it was in some cases the other Vietnamese, but it was also the U.S. Army. It was not poor peasants faced enemies that were not us. But this was also the moment, and this all shapes the contemporary environmental imaginary and cleanses it of a sense of environmental racism, is the Nixonian impulse, the Cold War impulse, that as he's engaging in chemical warfare in Vietnam, to give a speech where he says, let's all come together around the environment. It's essentially not a political issue. But really the roots of this thinking, of Anthropocene thinking, go back to nuclear hegemony on the right and systems dynamics. On the right is the Sage air defense system, which was developed by Jay Forrester, who would later develop the world model systems dynamic model of limits to growth in 1972 and become widely influential after that. On the left is the US Air Force's plan for a nuclear war, a first strike nuclear war against the Soviet Union in 1954. The historian who drew up this map from primary sources should get credit for it, and I'm going to apologize to him here. This is Forrester's model that is used in the limits to growth. What's striking about this is that the systems model used by environmentalists is very closely related to American imperialism and the drive for the automated battlefield. You can see there a long quote. You won't have time to read, but I'll share this the slides with everyone. Westmoreland, at the end, you can see the automated battlefield was his dream. The automated battlefield has today been realized under Obama and Trump with drone strikes that can go anywhere, of course, to kill poor brown people who think the United States is a problem in the world. So here I'm going to skip over this. This is Paul Ehrlich, who always said too many brown people, but I want us to be aware of the deployment of scientific and naturalistic imagery and metaphors to narrate and explain human affairs, including human affairs in the web of life. So just like the Anthropocene uses a particular system science and earth system science to justify planetary managerialism, and as a way of looking at the climate crisis, we can see it in earlier eras. The Malthusianism was in part a response to the Haitian Revolution, as well as working class revolts in England and France. And this recurs again and again and again. So eugenics in the late 19th century, populationism in the World Revolution of 1968. So to conclude, there's a lot here. Capitalocene, well, there's a lot of confusion around this. And for me, Capitalocene is an open invitation and an open provocation to connect the ways in which power, life, capital are interrelated in the most intimate ways, where we look at production and reproduction, at human and extra-human nature, all at the same time, which gives some people headaches. I tell my students, this is an ice cream headache problem. But the Capitalocene has always been, even before I started using this concept, it was always a critique of the idea of ecology plus economy. We have to put politics and geocultures of domination at the center. So we can't be content with various J-stick curves and then political economy that talks about secular stagnation, problems in the world rate of profit. We have to put at the core the climate class divide, climate apartheid, climate patriarchy. And I think that in order to put together these questions of domination, we need to look to the relations and political economy around work in all its forms, paid work, unpaid work. And we need to look at how super exploitation is fundamental, not just to the development of capitalism, but to understanding how ethno-nationalisms, calls for technical fixes and forms of colorblind racism that go with it are very much at the center of the 1%'s politics today. And finally, we should recognize that climate apartheid is not a symptom as such. It is not a result of the climate crisis, but a cause of it. Thank you.
Fantastic, Jason. Thank you so much for providing a original, and engaging, and important intervention on this very important topic. I, of course, invite our participants to put forward their questions, and either myself or Rachel Hegland will field those and make sure that you receive them. Until they come in, I will begin with a question for you regarding the future. So you've given us this rather sweeping overview of how we constructed this order in the past millennium, if not longer, how we've reached our present crisis. And how do you see this playing out in the future in terms of an environmental crisis, which is going to create, as you said, rather hard conditions, especially for people of color, that are concentrated in oftentimes some of the warmer and increasingly will be drier environments in the world, and what kinds of protests do you see emerging as a consequence of this, or what are some of the possibilities? Of course, I mean, you can't completely crystal ball this, but just in terms of looking at a historical sociology of protests, what do you see transpiring potentially in the future?
Well, let me take that the last phrasing, because I think it gives us something to think with. The classic formulation of the historical sociology of agrarian and social revolution was basically this: whenever ruling classes and producing classes find themselves in a zero-sum situation, revolutions or struggles over social revolution, attempted social revolutions, tend to occur. So, classically, the case of Vietnam, where the landlord class could not reorganize production to grow its way out of the crisis, resulted in a zero-sum situation in which it was either the landlords and Diem before he was killed, or it was the peasants. There was no middle ground for compromise. Now, I don't want to say what I'm going to say next, but what the climate crisis in the geophysical sense is doing is rendering the present political economic conjuncture a zero-sum situation. And Jeff, I know that you're more up on this literature than I am. Even bourgeois economists like Larry Summers now openly speak of secular stagnation.
Right.
And we also know from the agricultural data in the heartlands of world agriculture that we have a dramatic slowdown in productivity growth over the past 30 years in physical productivity growth, but also in labor productivity growth. Less marked in labor, but also there. So the climate crisis as a geophysical event is already suppressing the yield possibilities of industrial agriculture, not to mention the effects across the tropical zones of the world and subtropical zones of the world. Those are, of course, expanding. Here in upstate New York in November, it's in the high 60s. So it's not supposed to be like that. So what extreme heat does, of course, is suppress physical labor productivity outdoors, but also indoors for some reason that economists still don't understand. The extreme heat events suppress labor productivity indoors. And also, Jeff, I know that you're probably up on this too, better than I am. There is a long-term secular stagnation in labor productivity growth. Right. The much anticipated automation revolution that we all read about, depending on how old we are, but started coming in the 70s with Mandel and Toffler, never occurred. Instead of the global robot factory, we got the global sweatshop.
Right.
So we have a zero-sum situation. That be that as it is, there's no winter palace to storm. So the most likely parallel situation, not on a global scale, but on a regional scale, is the breakup of the Roman Empire. And in the Roman West, under the force of dramatic climate change, of internal political squabbles, of class revolt, slave revolt inside, and barbarian invasion from outside, all of that resulted in the destruction of one of the greatest slave societies in the history of humankind, the Roman West. So when people say socialism or barbarism, I say, I'll take the barbarism, thank you very much. Barbarians have destroyed more than one slave society. But in the East, it survived. Now, the story actually gets more hopeful than this. That in the old Roman West, peasants reorganized life. This was no Dark Ages period. This was a period where peasants who had been concentrated around the latifundia reestablished village life, reestablished a peasant mode of production with a much lower fertility regime, suggesting not only more equal relations between rich and poor, but also men and women. And so there's a long gradual decline in population, but not the abrupt fall that we learned long ago in school. So it was a moment of the dramatic improvement of the well-being of peasants. All right, the last thing I want to say is that the forms will be varied around the responses to the unfolding climate crisis. What I always resist the temptation to say, well, here's an environmental crisis, because I think on the one hand, climate change is not everything. I think it's impossible to understand any major political, social struggle or movement without internalizing a sense of how climate change is already shaping the conditions of social life, of social reproduction and well-being across the planet. I cited the 2019 study from the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science on how climate change already is amplifying this climate class divide and this climate, the world inequality. And so we're in a moment. Now, ruling classes have been willing to allow the climate crisis to unfold and unleash all sorts of devastation. So they're really pretty much unconcerned about dealing with that. And then the other part of the history of the 20th century is that quote from the US Army major during the Tet Offensive: it became necessary to destroy the town in order to save it, which was also the American position towards the Soviet Union and China.
Right, right. Just another provocation, if I can offer one. I mean, so, thinking about, I don't know, the past 50 years or so, and, looking at spatial fixes and factor accumulation as mechanisms for resolving what was a crisis of accumulation in capital. So of course, I mean, we well know that we have reached the end of that system's ability to produce the kinds of returns to capital that they previously had. So it looks as if an intensification of that system, of course, just simply will not work, and especially for the environmental or ecological reasons that you've just stated. But if the system implodes, I mean, given the number of people that we have in the world, now, of course, I mean, and as you've just suggested, I mean, people are living at varying levels of material wealth. And so, it's not as if we have a Thomas Friedman flat world at all. We have more inequality perhaps than ever. But rather than looking like the collapse of the Roman Empire and a improvement in the conditions of the peasantry, which, by the way, we also saw after the Haitian Revolution, right? So in other words, the plantation system ultimately collapses, not because the Haitian government wants it to collapse, because the peasants demand it, and they escape into the hillsides, and they begin a system of subsistence production, which made them really quite well off for about a century until the Americans came back in. But I mean, but could it look more like the episodic or periodic collapses of the Maya in Central America, in which this inability of the environment to have a carrying capacity for as many people that they then had would be reproduced in the present? What do you think about that?
Well, I think in the abstract, of course, there is a certain biological productivity of the earth, but I don't think that that's in question around, I mean, you're not doing this at all, Jeff, but in terms of the language of carrying capacity, which has been an enormously plastic and flexible instrument used
Sure.
by, really by neo-Malthusian.
Often reactionary forces.
Often, but
sure.
even when used in a more open way, lead us to a position of hopelessness. I think that there's that I think that the catastrophism and collapsism of even the environmentalist left is significantly overstated, by which I don't mean, and I want to be very clear, capitalism has already and is now imposing very real catastrophes on humans and the rest of nature all around the world.
Right.
This kind of American millenarianism, sorry, I can't speak today, goes very deep. Betsy Hartman talks about America's love affair with the apocalypse, and it's very much true. And you can see this very much in American environmentalism. Jared Diamond, Bellamy Foster has his own version of this. I don't think so. And as I've argued repeatedly, capitalism will not continue until the last tree is cut, which of course is a rephrasing of Max Weber's famous statement about will continue until the last ton of coal is dug. And that's not, that kind of machinic metaphor is essentially a systems metaphor like we see in Limits to Growth. It does not foreground the actually existing relations of power and the struggles over political economy that are there. Also, finally, I would say that global capital is really in a difficult spot right now. Many of us read Bloomberg's report on how $13 trillion plus are parked in essentially treasury bills and other forms of government security at zero or even negative rates of return.
Yeah, right.
And that's just the tip of the iceberg. Consider all the high-end real estate in which capital is parked in climate vulnerable places around the world, like Miami, or even, let me say, Manhattan, where the storm surges will come, and what's going to happen to real estate values, San Francisco, other places around the world. So I think not a collapse, but something that looks more like the breakup of the Western Roman Empire. Of course, the Roman Empire survives for another millennia.
Right.
And then also a feudalism, where the crisis of feudalism as a product of climate and class revolt really stymies the ruling classes of Western Europe for a time. It looks like we have a question.
Yeah, we've got, we even have four, some three of them in addition to the one in the Q&A section have emerged from the chat section. So I'll just repeat those to you. So we have one from a very well-known activist here in Milwaukee, Biko Baker, who says, but I'd like to hear your thoughts on automation, the increase in leisure time and restructuring of our work days. For example, more men taking on traditional women's roles due to the ability to work from home, etc.
Right. I mean, automation has always been this, I don't mean from the questioner, but it's been a kind of bourgeois fantasy. And it turns out that the parts of our lives that have been the most automated are the parts where we do all the work, like when we're at the grocery store and we do all the checking out, or things like that. There are, of course, some parts of the economy that have been automated, but we also know that, well, this is a discussion in the trucking industry right now, that it will not free up more leisure time. It will free up more capital, boost the rate of profit, but then also put a lot of people out of work, which is not an old-fashioned Luddite position. It's simply to point to the very real limits of automation under conditions of capitalism. And that's an old Marxist argument that, you know, every advance in labor-saving machinery doesn't give us more leisure time.
Yeah, well, and I think, as you know as well, of course, in the past 40 years, rather than the work week declining, it has actually increased for most. So in other words, factor accumulation is working to just make people work harder and longer. Okay, so a few other questions. I want to get through these before people have to take off. We have one from Lois Wilkin, who asks, does the US administration's neglect, exploitation of the pandemic fit into racial capitalism? Many of its victims are or will be white people. Are they the new indentured servants?
Well, white workers are racialized too, of course, and American. So the short answer is yes, of course. We live in the white republic. We live in an apartheid capitalist republic, and that's why we're all checking in on the news to see what the Electoral College is, which is, you know, a white republic kind of political institution. I mean, I think what we're seeing with the American ruling class today is a kind of decadence, a kind of pathology in which they are not even able to deal with the basic conditions of social welfare and social reproduction, which would be good for business. And so in contrast, the Chinese, and we can say what we want about Chinese society, and of course, so we can all have our criticisms, but they took care of COVID right away. And so we can really, pardon?
I mean, in other words, an effective state, something that has degraded significantly in, for lack of a better term, the Western world.
Right. I mean, the U.S. In the early 1970s, the great political economist James O'Connor talked about the warfare welfare state. But today, it's just the warfare state.
Right.
So, yeah, I think that,
which is, as you know, it's one of the reasons how the crisis of accumulation was resolved, right? I mean, so you have spoken about the cost of reproduction. Well, you begin to mine the resources that previously were used for enabling the reproduction of the state. So, you know, with predictable consequences, of course, ensuing, as we're seeing right now.
So absolutely. So yes, COVID is racialized capitalism, and but really it's but not in the sense that our categories are not black and white. That it is the multiracial working class that is fundamentally screwed through this whole process, where, you know, Pelosi is worth $100 million and Trump is worth $1 billion. They don't want to provide any relief to small business. They don't want to provide any relief to working class people of any color. But of course, because we do live in racialized capitalism, workers of color are always disproportionately affected.
Right. Okay, another question from Ali Alper Almadar. How can we conceptualize the gig economy through the world ecology perspective? Is it a new way of cheapening labor by what, of course, Guy Standing called the precaritization, both in the global north and south?
I mean, I think the short answer is yes. I mean, I think what we're seeing is that in a way, the precariat is the normal condition of the working class, and here's where I think I can speak to it maybe in an intelligent way. What capital needs to do in order to revive the conditions of accumulation is deal with the question of social reproduction. And instead, what tech capital especially is doing is moving in precisely the opposite direction. So you have, I mean, famously with Uber, you have the largest taxi service in the world and owns no taxis, or maybe a few self-driving cars experimentally, but you get the picture. So the gig economy is a way of pushing the burden of privatizing even more dramatically the burden of social reproduction.
Right. Which again matches the project of capital, just as you've articulated in terms of the 1980s of companies increasingly shedding their production responsibilities because they provided opportunities for labor to mobilize against them.
Right.
So, just take ownership of the brand and outsource everything else in as much as you can. And it certainly weakens the position of labor.
Well, I think that's, there's that great quote from Marx that I put out there that about black skin, white skin, and labor will never be free. And I can't help but think that part of the tremendous gap in the political and intellectual discussion on the left about how to put together race, class, and climate is from the breaking of the back of the American working class in the 1970s and 80s. I mean, just talking about the American scene, and of course, there's a much larger global picture, but then also going much deeper to the anti-communist purges of the 1950s, because the communist project was never about communism in America. It was always about black-white unity. And this is a point made by Robin Kelley and Manning Marable, and of course, W.E.B. Du Bois, who actually joined the Communist Party. It was about building a multiracial working class politics in which our discussions of race, class, and gender in the context of the American empire, itself an environment making machine, those discussions could be had. And so one of the results of that historic process of class defeat and breaking black-white unity is that today there are these discussions of race, class, climate that are very, very disconnected. And it seems to me that that's not just an academic point.
Indeed. Jason, I'm going to bring our event to a conclusion as we try and keep ourselves more or less on schedule. And I think it also increases the likelihood that people will view it later on Facebook or on YouTube. I want to thank you for what was really an important and stimulating intervention of just impressive sweep, one which really helps us to understand our past, present, and future. I suspect you're going to be building some fascinating seminars around this, and to all of our benefit. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Jeff. It's been an honor to talk with all of you.
Great. Take care to all. Thanks for all who were able to attend, to tender questions. And again, we'll certainly be making this superb presentation available through both YouTube and Facebook. So thank you. Take care all.